If you're struggling in life, watch this, listen carefully. Right now, somewhere deep inside, you might be carrying a weight that nobody else can see. You wake up every morning, you go through the motions, you smile when you're supposed to smile. You say, I'm fine, when people ask how you're doing, but inside you're tired. Tired of fighting the same battles, tired of overthinking, tired of wondering when life is finally going to get better. And maybe you've started believing that everyone else has figured it out except you. But what if the struggle you're experiencing isn't proof that you're failing? What if it's proof that you're growing? Because every person who has ever found peace, strength, wisdom, or purpose has walked through seasons where nothing made sense. Moments when they doubted themselves, moments when they felt lost, moments when they wanted to quit. The truth is, struggle is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of your transformation. And today, I want to share something that could completely change the way you look at your pain, your setbacks, and the challenges that have been weighing on your heart. Because the greatest mistake people make is believing that suffering means something is wrong with them. It doesn't. Life was never meant to be free from difficulty. The storms come for everyone. The difference is that some people learn how to find wisdom inside the storm. Some people discover a strength they never knew they possessed. And some people emerge from their darkest chapter carrying a light powerful enough to guide others. So if you've been feeling overwhelmed, if you've been questioning yourself, if you've been wondering whether you have what it takes to keep going, don't leave. This message is for you. Because before this speech ends, I want you to see your struggles differently. Not as evidence that you're broken, but as evidence that you're becoming the person you were meant to be. Take a deep breath, open your mind, and let's begin. Have you ever noticed that the people who give the most are often the ones who ask for the least? They are the ones who remember the small details, the ones who check in when everyone else gets busy, the ones who somehow find the right words when you're falling apart. They carry conversations, relationships, and emotional burdens without making a show of it. They don't keep score. They don't demand recognition. They don't constantly remind people of everything they've done. They simply give because it is part of who they are. They believe that kindness matters. They believe that love should be offered freely. They believe that helping someone through a difficult season is just what human beings are supposed to do for one another. But there is something most people never understand about individuals like this. Their generosity is often mistaken for endless availability. Their patience is mistaken for weakness. Their forgiveness is mistaken for permission. And their willingness to stay is mistaken for an inability to leave. At first, they don't notice it. Or perhaps they do notice it, but they choose to ignore it. They tell themselves that everyone has flaws. They tell themselves that people are stressed, distracted, overwhelmed, or struggling with their own problems. They make excuses for behavior that would drive most people away. They give another chance, then another after that. Not because they enjoy being hurt, but because they genuinely see the humanity in others. They understand pain. They understand mistakes. They understand that nobody gets everything right. The problem begins when their kindness becomes expected rather than appreciated. The moment something becomes expected, its value starts disappearing in the eyes of the person receiving it. What once felt like a gift starts feeling like an entitlement. What once inspired gratitude starts feeling normal. The supportive text message becomes something people assume will arrive. The listening ear becomes something people assume will always be available. The emotional support becomes something people feel entitled to receive without ever considering what it costs the person providing it. And that's where the danger begins. Because the empath is still giving, still listening, still showing up, but something is changing beneath the surface. Every relationship operates on energy, whether people acknowledge it or not. Every conversation requires energy. Every act of support requires energy. Every moment spent helping someone through their struggles requires emotional investment. Most people think exhaustion comes from physical labor. Sometimes the deepest exhaustion comes from carrying emotional weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. Imagine pouring water into a cup every single day. At first, it's easy. Then someone asks for more. Then another person arrives with an empty cup. Then another. Soon you're pouring into everyone around you while nobody notices your own cup running dry. That is often what life feels like for an empath. They become the safe place for everyone else. Friends call them during crisis. Family members rely on them for emotional stability. Partners lean on them for understanding and reassurance. Colleagues unload their frustrations onto them. Strangers even find themselves opening up around them. They become a source of comfort wherever they go. But who is checking on the person everyone depends on? Who is asking about their pain? Who is listening when they need support? Who is paying attention when their smile starts looking forced? The answer too often is nobody. Not because people are cruel. Not because people intentionally want to hurt them, but because human beings have an incredible ability to become comfortable with what is consistently available. We adapt. We normalize. We stop noticing gifts that are always present. And while everyone else is getting comfortable, the empath is becoming tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. The kind of tired that doesn't disappear after a good night's sleep. The kind of tired that comes from feeling invisible. Because here's the truth. Empaths do not need constant praise. They do not need applause. They do not need a spotlight. What they need is simple acknowledgement. They need to know that their efforts matter. They need to feel that the care they give is recognized. They need to experience reciprocity. Not perfection, not equal scores, just evidence that the relationship flows in both directions. When that evidence disappears, something begins to crack. The first signs are subtle. They become quieter. They share less about their lives. They stop reaching out first. They stop volunteering their energy as often. They start observing instead of participating. Most people never notice these changes because they are too focused on what they need rather than what the empath is experiencing. And that's the tragic part. People often assume the empath is fine because they remain kind, they remain polite, they remain patient. But kindness does not always mean someone is happy. Patience does not always mean someone is okay. Silence does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes silence is the final stage before departure. The empath watches. They observe patterns. They notice who only calls when they need something. They notice who disappears when support is needed in return. They notice who takes and takes and takes without ever asking how they are doing. They notice every broken promise, every one-sided interaction, every moment where their humanity was overlooked. And they remember, not because they are keeping a list, not because they want revenge, but because pain leaves impressions. Eventually a realization arrives, a quiet realization, a powerful realization, a life-changing realization. They begin to understand that love should not require self-abandonment. They begin to understand that compassion does not mean tolerating endless disrespect. They begin to understand that helping others should not come at the cost of destroying themselves. And once that awareness takes root, everything changes. The people around them often expect a dramatic confrontation. They expect arguments. They expect accusations. They expect emotional explosions. But that is rarely what happens. The empath simply becomes unavailable. The calls become less frequent. The messages become shorter. The emotional investment disappears. The person who once carried the relationship stops carrying it. And suddenly, those who took them for granted are shocked. They wonder what happened. They wonder why things feel different. They wonder why the person who always showed up is no longer there. What they fail to realize is that the departure didn't happen overnight. It happened one unnoticed disappointment at a time, one unappreciated sacrifice at a time, one ignored feeling at a time. one taken for granted act of kindness at a time. By the time the empath walks away, they have usually spent months, sometimes years, trying to make things work. They have already fought battles internally that nobody else ever saw. They have already wrestled with guilt, hope, loyalty, and disappointment. They have already given more chances than most people would ever consider giving. And when they finally choose distance, it is rarely an act of anger. It is an act of survival. Because eventually even the kindest heart learns that being needed is not the same as being valued. And once that lesson is learned deeply enough, they stop giving their energy to people who only notice their worth after they've gone. There is a wound that many people never see because it leaves no visible scar. It doesn't show up in photographs. It doesn't announce itself in dramatic moments. It happens quietly, conversation by conversation, comment by comment, until one day a person no longer feels safe being themselves around you. That wound is created when someone's feelings are repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or ignored. For an empath, this kind of experience cuts deeper than most people realize. Not because they are weak, not because they are overly emotional, but because they spend so much of their lives paying attention to what others feel. They notice shifts in tone. They sense discomfort behind a smile. They hear pain hidden beneath words. They instinctively create space for other people's emotions. They make people feel heard, understood, and accepted. So when they finally express their own feelings and are met with indifference, criticism, or dismissal, it creates a level of disappointment that is difficult to describe. Think about it for a moment. Imagine spending years making sure everyone around you feels seen. Imagine listening without judgment. Imagine supporting people through heartbreak, anxiety, fear, uncertainty, and loss. Then imagine gathering the courage to share your own struggle, only to hear someone say, "You're overthinking it," or "You're too sensitive," or "You're making a big deal out of nothing." To the person saying those words, it may seem harmless. To the empath receiving them, it feels like a door quietly closing. Because what they hear is not the sentence itself. What they hear is something deeper. They hear, "Your feelings don't matter." They hear, "I don't want to understand you." They hear, "What you're experiencing isn't important enough for my attention." And the human heart remembers those messages. Not once, not twice, but over time. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing that emotional invalidation only happens through obvious cruelty. The truth is, it often happens through subtle behaviors. Interrupting someone when they're trying to explain how they feel. Changing the subject whenever emotions become uncomfortable. Making jokes about someone's sensitivity. Treating their concerns as inconveniences rather than experiences that deserve understanding. Each individual moment may seem small, but relationships are built from small moments. Trust is built from small moments. Emotional safety is built from small moments. And emotional distance is built the exact same way. Every time an empath feels dismissed, a small piece of openness disappears. Not immediately, not dramatically, gradually. The next time they share something personal, they hold back a little. The next time they're struggling, they reveal only part of the story. The next time they feel hurt, they tell themselves to keep it inside. And little by little, the person who once shared everything begins sharing almost nothing. What's fascinating is that many people don't notice this shift happening. They continue believing the relationship is exactly the same. They continue assuming everything is fine. Meanwhile, the empath is quietly adjusting their expectations. They stop expecting understanding. They stop expecting support. They stop expecting emotional connection. And when expectations disappear, attachment often begins fading with them. The reality is that every person wants to feel emotionally safe. Every person wants to feel accepted. Every person wants to know that their inner world matters. But for empaths, this need often carries special significance because they naturally offer that gift to everyone else. When they speak about their feelings, they are not usually looking for someone to solve their problems. They're not asking for perfection. They're not demanding complete agreement. Most of the time, they're simply asking to be heard. That's it. To be heard. To know that their emotions are not being judged. To know that their experiences are not being dismissed. To know that someone cares enough to listen before offering opinions. And yet so many people skip this step. They rush into correction mode. They rush into advice mode. They rush into criticism mode. Instead of listening, they start evaluating. Instead of understanding, they start defending. Instead of connecting, they start dismissing. The empath notices every one of these reactions, not because they're searching for flaws, but because they're highly attuned to emotional dynamics. They can feel when someone is genuinely present. They can feel when someone is merely waiting for their turn to speak. They can feel when someone values their perspective, and they can certainly feel when someone doesn't. Over time, repeated invalidation creates something dangerous inside the relationship. Resentment, not explosive resentment, not loud resentment. Quiet resentment, the kind that grows in silence, the kind that develops when someone continually sacrifices authenticity to avoid conflict. The empath starts asking themselves difficult questions. Why do I always listen but never feel heard? Why do I always understand but rarely feel understood? Why do I always make space for others while nobody makes space for me? These questions don't disappear once they appear. They linger. They grow. And eventually they force a decision. Because every healthy relationship requires emotional reciprocity, not identical contributions, not perfect balance, but mutual care, mutual respect, mutual willingness to understand one another. Without those things, relationships become emotionally exhausting. The empath begins noticing that they feel drained after certain conversations. They notice that they leave interactions feeling smaller rather than stronger. They notice that expressing vulnerability no longer feels safe. And once vulnerability becomes unsafe, genuine connection becomes impossible. Many people believe relationships end because of major betrayals. Sometimes they do. But often relationships slowly dissolve because one person stopped feeling emotionally valued. No scandal, no dramatic fight, no explosive argument. Just a gradual realization that their feelings have no place in the relationship. And when that realization becomes impossible to ignore, the empath starts protecting themselves. They become more private, more guarded, more selective about what they reveal. People around them often misinterpret this change. They assume the empath is becoming distant for no reason. They assume they're being cold. They assume they're pulling away unfairly. What they fail to understand is that emotional withdrawal usually begins long before physical withdrawal. The empath has already experienced countless moments where openness resulted in disappointment. They have already learned that expressing themselves leads to dismissal. They have already discovered that vulnerability is not welcomed, so they stop offering it not out of punishment, out of self-preservation. Because nobody can continue exposing their heart where it consistently feels unwelcome. Eventually, a turning point arrives, a moment when they realize that constantly defending their emotions is exhausting. A moment when they realize they shouldn't have to convince people that their feelings are real. A moment when they understand that healthy relationships do not require endless explanations just to receive basic empathy. And once they reach that point, something shifts forever. They stop chasing understanding from people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop seeking validation from people determined to invalidate them. They stop fighting for emotional space in places where their feelings are treated like burdens. And perhaps the most surprising part is how quietly this transformation happens. No announcement, no warning, no dramatic speech. Just a gradual withdrawal of emotional access. The person who once shared their deepest thoughts now keeps them private. The person who once trusted freely now chooses carefully. The person who once stayed despite being hurt begins recognizing their own worth, because eventually they realize something powerful. Being sensitive is not a flaw. Feeling deeply is not a weakness. Having emotions is not something that requires apology. And anyone who repeatedly makes them feel otherwise is not protecting their peace. They are disturbing it. The empath learns that emotional safety is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And once they discover environments, relationships, and people who allow them to be fully seen without judgment, they rarely return to places where their feelings were consistently dismissed, minimized, or made to feel like they never mattered at all. Trust is one of the most valuable things an empath can offer another human being. It is not given casually, even if it appears that way from the outside. People often assume that because empaths are kind, open, hearted, and willing to see the good in others, they trust too easily. What they fail to understand is that an empath is not blind to flaws. They see them. They notice inconsistencies. They recognize imperfections. The difference is that they choose to believe that people can grow. They choose to believe that mistakes do not always define a person's character. They choose to give others opportunities to become better versions of themselves. That choice comes from hope. And hope is a powerful thing. Hope allows an empath to stay when others would leave. Hope allows them to forgive what others would never forgive. Hope allows them to look beyond a person's worst moment and focus on their potential. But hope also creates vulnerability. Because when you repeatedly choose to believe in someone, every betrayal carries more weight than people realize. Most betrayals do not begin with a single dramatic event. They begin with small cracks, a promise that wasn't kept, a truth that wasn't fully told, a secret that should have remained protected, but somehow found its way into someone else's ears, a commitment that was spoken confidently but abandoned when it became inconvenient. At first, the empath notices these things but remains patient. They tell themselves everyone makes mistakes. They tell themselves nobody is perfect. They tell themselves that one bad decision does not erase all the good, and often they are right. Healthy relationships can survive mistakes. Strong relationships can survive misunderstandings. Trust can recover from occasional failures when there is accountability, honesty, and genuine effort. But repeated betrayals create a different story. Repeated betrayals create patterns, and empaths pay attention to patterns. They may not react immediately. They may not confront every issue the moment it appears. They may remain calm while everyone else assumes nothing is wrong. But beneath that calm exterior, they are observing. They are gathering information. They are watching actions instead of listening to promises. Because eventually they learn a lesson that changes everything. Words reveal intentions. Actions reveal priorities. And when those two things stop matching, trust begins disappearing. One of the greatest misunderstandings people have about empaths is believing they are endlessly forgiving. The truth is more complicated. Empaths often forgive because they understand human imperfection. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness allows someone to release bitterness. Trust allows someone to feel safe. You can forgive someone and still no longer trust them. You can wish someone well and still decide they no longer belong in your life. You can understand why someone hurt you and still recognize that their presence is unhealthy. Many people confuse forgiveness with permission. They assume that because an empath forgave them once, they will continue forgiving forever. They assume that because the empath remained after previous disappointments, they will remain after future ones. This assumption becomes dangerous because every betrayal leaves evidence behind. Every broken promise creates doubt. Every dishonest moment weakens certainty. Every manipulation damages connection. And while these injuries may not be visible, they accumulate. Imagine a piece of glass. One crack may not shatter it, neither will two, maybe not even 10. But eventually, the structure changes. The glass may still appear intact from a distance, yet its strength is no longer what it once was. Trust works the same way. From the outside, everything may seem normal.